Okay, we are for around 4 minutes to 7 p.m. as scheduled, and I think we already have Professor Andy Summer here. Thank Andy for coming. And I also saw many colleagues here, very close colleague. I saw Acho there, and then
Hello,
Alan,
Haris.
yeah,
Hey, Andy.
hey, I saw Paroni. Paroni, apa kabar? Okay. Well, this is we are very fortunate that we have our guest lecturer. So this is basically the class of Indonesian economy. We have Indonesian economy class for our undergraduate students. Actually, the one who are assigned to teach is not only me here, but there are also Pak Teguh Santoso here, and then Pak Martin Daniel, and then I have Bu Titi Anas too here. Bu Titi Anas is also the one of the co-teacher of this. So for this semester, we will have two guest lecturer. The first will be Andy, and then the second one later will be Professor Budi Resudarmo that will talk about more about regional aspect of this. So we are very, very glad. But before we begin, I would like to introduce Andy first. Some of you maybe already know him, but some of you maybe not. So let me introduce him a bit. So Andy is very long friend of mine. Yeah. So he's now so he's now a professor, yeah, professor in King's College London. He is a professor of international development in King's College London. He lived in St. Albans, nearby city, nearby London. He commute when he teach. He is also director of the ESRC Global Challenge Strategic Research Network on Global Poverty and Inequality Dynamics, where actually me and some other colleagues such as Bu Armida is part of this project. Yeah? And he also a non-resident senior fellow at UNU Wider at Helsinki. And he has also associate positions in Oxford, in CGDEF, Center for Global Development, Washington DC, and also he has a research associate also in SDG Center of Universitas Pajajaran, Bandung. Yeah, so he's actually part of us as well. So for so long, yeah. And then he's been actually very productive in the academic world. So I just want to list some of his work that may be relevant for us here. He just recently published a book on development and distribution, yeah, by Oxford University Press. And aside that, apart from that, he also has other. I don't have room for putting all his books here, but so this is one of the relevant one that you may want to look at if you're interested of his work. And also, of course, he published a lot. So far, he has published 72 journal article, and others in yeah, listed here with very big, very large citations and also high index. So I think that's without further ado. So Andy will talk about structural transformation in Indonesia, especially in the global context, yeah, in the global context. And I think this is very important because what Andy has been doing recently, I think is very up to date in terms of the thinking, in terms of the literature, yeah, that maybe can give you a different perspective, yeah, about what happened in terms of structural transformation in the developing country in general or in Indonesia in particular. After this, then you have a chance also to have if you have question later, you can write your question there in the text. For those of you who watch us on YouTube, you can also ask question in the chat box on the right side of the screen, yeah, and I will monitor that question, and then I will try to ask that question later in the question and answer. So without further ado, I'll give the screen and the microphone, if I may, to Andy. Time is for Andy. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, Arif. Thank you for the nice introduction. Thank you very much for inviting me to do this. It's really nice to be able to speak to your colleagues and your students and others. I got interested in the subject years ago of economic development and thinking about different patterns of economic development. And I think many things are starting to change, and that's really one of the things I want to talk about today. I think what I'd like to do is talk a bit about the broader context for developing countries and structural transformation, economic development, or the shift of resources between and within sectors, and also link some of these debates with thinking about inequality as well, and those kind of issues. So I'm just going to share my screen. You can hear me okay, I guess. I guess I should check these things. Yeah. Arif has a thumbs up. That's a good sign. Right. So if I share screen, right, you can see my screen now, I hope. Yeah. So here's the PowerPoints. Right. So I want to talk about structural transformation and some thinking about Indonesia's incredible journey, particularly from the late 60s to the late 1990s and then since, but also set that in a kind of context whereby many of the changes in the global economy have been very important in driving structural transformation over the years, and I'll talk a bit about that. Also, I think comparison to other developing countries and some of the broader trends. So after a brief introduction, I want to say a little bit about structural transformation. So structural transformation is shortened to ST. It's a very long phrase, actually. I'm quite glad to be shortening it. So structural transformation, what's supposed to happen? Then think a little bit about what actually happened in developing countries, what has happened, and then think about structural transformation in Indonesia in 3 waves. And then think in terms of the conclusion, looking back and looking forward. So first of all, I think it's fair to say that patterns of structural transformation in developing countries differ quite dramatically. There's many countries like Indonesia that have built an industrial base, have industrialized to a considerable extent. And actually now the issues are sustaining industrialization, sustaining manufacturing, and issues around the tertiarization of employment and what that means for future growth and inequality. Which points towards a question about whether there's actually new or unexpected forms of structural transformation or earlier than expected forms of structural transformation in developing countries, which I'll come to. And then looking ahead, I think there's actually a kind of big question for middle income developing countries like Indonesia, which is trying to choose between what I call the tertiary trilemma. And I'll come to that ahead. It's really a tension between the generation of value added and the generation of employment. I'll talk a bit about that. So really, I'm trying to deal with 2 questions, I think. The first is, how was structural transformation achieved in the past? And the second is, how will structural transformation be achieved in the future? So just to recap, what I mean by structural transformation is really this transfer of resources from low productivity sectors to higher productivity sectors. It's particularly associated when we go back to the pioneers of development economics, the people like Arthur Lewis and many others. If we think of the kind of what's supposed to happen in a very general sense, countries start out with low income and are largely agricultural economies. Then over time, industrialization and manufacturing particularly expands. And then at some point, the services sector start to become more important for value added in employment. And certainly if you look at some countries, not only the richer countries, but also countries that developed a little bit later, you can see a sort of general pattern of this bump or inverted U-curve in terms of the manufacturing sector in particular. But then when we look at developing countries, what we see is in a way not necessarily the same as what industrializing countries experienced, nor perhaps the same as what the earlier industrializing nations of the developed world, such as South Korea, have experienced. So in the top sort of graphs, if you look at the period from 1960 onwards and the manufacturing employment shares and manufacturing value added shares, what you see is the developed nations achieved a higher peak and a higher income per capita through manufacturing than what seems to be the case with the developing and former developing countries. So by former developing countries here, I mean countries like South Korea, Taiwan, and that group of the newly, what were the newly industrializing countries. And then when you look at developing countries today, you can see that the curve hasn't yet peaked, but it certainly seems to be slowing down its ascent. It may well have peaked in the employment shares in general. These are average across the countries in each of the subgroups here, from the Groningen Growth and Development Center 10-sector database. But then when we look at pre and post 1990, we see something that is potentially quite important, I think. So prior to 1990, we tend to see a sort of a rising curve in terms of manufacturing employment shares, manufacturing value-added shares. And that's whether you look at the Groningen Growth and Development data sets, which in theory includes the formal and informal sector because it's based on census data as well as labour force data, versus the UNIDO data, which is very much formal manufacturing sector. So you see a change certainly across manufacturing, but if you take UNIDO's data to be the formal sector, which is how it's collected, then you see a much more dramatic shift in manufacturing in developing countries post 1990. So this kind of feeds into, or this is part of an existing discussion around debates about premature deindustrialization or early tertiarization. And the basic argument is developing countries today face a lower peak in manufacturing shares and manufacturing peaking at lower income per capita, which effectively means the economic and social benefits of industrialization are being exhausted earlier than previous industrializers, which is potentially worrying in terms of the potential of manufacturing to provide enormous amounts of employment. We can talk a little bit about what might have changed pre and post 1990. One of the biggest changes, of course, was the very clear emergence of a global production framed by global value chains. The fragmentation of production around the world was one of the biggest changes after the end of the Cold War, and we can see that over the period since 1990 in particular, although it was very likely going on before that, facilitated by information communication technology and liberalization. And then when we think a little bit about each of the regions, here we have a fourth sector demarcation. We have employment and value added, and we compare regions by shares in GDP and employment, or value added employment against income per capita. What we see is, in some ways, the agriculture sector has declined, as one might expect, albeit not necessarily in the smoothest fashion in some regions. We also see a rise in the manufacturing shares. Obviously, East Asia is EA, LA is Latin America, SA is Sub-Saharan Africa, SA is South Asia. And we see that's a very nice peak in East Asia there on value added. But what we see is what seems to be a leveling off of manufacturing shares in terms of a plateau, something that you can see too in the Latin America manufacturing data, and actually a decline in manufacturing in Latin America. At the same time, we obviously see this quite substantial rise in the service share of employment. And in particular, sort of jumps there around in Latin America. So we see quite a bit of regional heterogeneity, which leads me to a way of thinking about issues around structural transformation and manufacturing, whereby there are multiple forms or varieties of structural transformation, and then we can start thinking about contemporary exemplars. I'm indebted to Arif for the drawing of the figure on the left-hand side. We had a table and another figure, but Arif produced it in a much more visually sensible and attractive fashion. So we can think about what happens to the manufacturing employment share, and if we think about what happens to the manufacturing value added share. So we might think of a primary industrialization, of which India might be an exemplar, whereby the value added share hasn't yet peaked. So the value added share may have peaked, but the employment share has not peaked. We could think of an upgrading industrialization, which is more the China model of industrialization, where perhaps neither value added nor employment have peaked. We can think of a stalled industrialization, which I think may be where Indonesia is in terms of certainly looking at the manufacturing shares of the economy. And then we can also think about a deindustrialization, whether that's premature or not. And I think Brazil fits that kind of example. I mean, it's plausible that the stalled industrialization is well, there's all sorts of debates about what it could be, not least the kind of the impact of a commodity boom has in terms of neglecting manufacturing. But we could talk about some of those issues as we go forward. And I think this all matters a lot because it means that some countries are moving into territory where the tertiary sector becomes the main employer. The one difference between the tertiary sector and the manufacturing sector is it's very likely a much more unequal sector within sector, in the sense that services can be high value added, banking, finance, these kind of things, but also services can be very low value added too. So there's quite a lot of difference in the sector. Mm-hmm. So that makes me think a little bit about what we've called in some of the work we've been doing, Arif, myself, and others at UNU wider, on a Kuznets tension. Of course, when you think about inequality and structural transformation, you tend to think about Simon Kuznets, and you tend to think about the idea that as workers move from a less from a sort of low productivity sector to a higher productivity sector, whether that's Kuznets's rural to urban or Lewis's modern to traditional, you tend to see a rise in inequality. And actually, when we look at the associations here, and this draws on the work of Kunal Sen in Journal of Development Studies, we tend to see that actually manufacturing is associated with falling or increases in the employment shares in manufacturing tends to be correlated, at least, with falling income, whereas increases in fire services, that's finance, insurance, real estate, the kind of high valued services, or the non-fire services, hotels, catering, communication, so forth, that tends to be associated with rising inequality. So it could be looking ahead, some of the patterns developing countries are starting to see could be unequalizing and could lead to social tensions. And I think underlying this is a kind of a 2x2 model that Arif and myself have been using in the work with wider, where we think about inequality as increasing or stable, and growth enhancing structural transformation as weak or strong. So you can see that inequality can be increasing with weak or strong structural transformation, and the two could be high income East Asia versus India and China, or inequality can be stable or declining. I think that's the case in terms of weak structural transformation in Sub-Saharan Latin America over the most recent period versus strong structural transformation in East Asia. And we excluded China in this because we dealt with it elsewhere. So these are some of the kind of broader debates I think that are going on around structural transformation in developing countries, particularly around tertiarization of employment and it's potentially unequalized in effect, but also the possible exhaustion of the social and economic benefits of manufacturing at a much earlier stage than might have been expected historically. So let me turn to say something about Indonesia next, and structural transformation in Indonesia. So I think many of you who are listening to this will know much more than I do. But for me, there's really three waves of structural transformation. There's a first wave, which is from the late 60s to the early 80s. There's a second wave from the mid 80s to the mid 1990s, which is absolutely incredible transformation. And then there's also a third wave from the late 1990s onwards that seems to be associated with stalling industrialization and tertiarization of employment. So I said a little bit about each of the periods, and then think a bit about what might we conclude from all of this in terms of structural transformation in the past and structural transformation in the future. So in terms of the first wave from the late 1960s or early 70s to the early 80s, I think you can think about two columns. One is the structural transformation itself, the drivers, the orchestration, the social base. But then you also can think about this Kuznetian tension between structural transformation and inequality. Essentially, structural transformation leads to divergences, unleashes divergences between urban and rural sectors, skilled and unskilled workers, the employed versus the under or unemployed. And so in terms of the first wave of structural transformation, clearly the oil boom and the resources that created was very important to funding structural transformation in the manufacturing sector in Indonesia, and the infrastructure and other factors that were necessary. I think the context for the Suharto era might be framed as classical developmentalism, in the sense of a activist state managing the economy with certainly up to the early 80s with quite a strong emphasis on the role of the state, albeit with some foreign investment. And then there was a social basis to those years, which of course was raising living standards rapidly in the parts of the country where most people lived, certainly in the early 70s and onwards, the agriculture and the rural sector. At the same time, there was, I think, in terms of the divergences, Indonesia managed to balance the urban-rural divergence very substantially with a focus on rural development, infrastructure, agricultural policy, food policy. There was also, I think, an attempt to manage the divergence between skilled and unskilled workers by expanding primary education, expanding the supply of more skilled workers. And also, I think there was some trade-offs between the employed and the under or unemployed in terms of a push for employment expansion rather than necessarily faster real wage growth as a result of productivity increases. And so we see financing through natural resource rents and external debt. We see a dramatic fall in agriculture employment, rises in manufacturing value-added employment, dramatic rises in manufacturing productivity, and growth driven by physical capital when one decomposes the growth data. The export structure was also very important in terms of dramatic rise in manufacturing and fuel exports, and fall in agriculture and oil and metals. So if we take the data from the Groningen data set, we see these very dramatic rises in manufacturing. Indonesia's rise in value added was really quite incredible in terms of the steepness of the curve compared to other parts of Southeast Asia. Here we're comparing Thailand and Malaysia. Employment increased less so, but it still increased in terms of manufacturing. And in all three countries here, you can see this sort of gentle decline in agriculture over the period, and sort of equally sort of gentle slight rise in services over the period. Then again, if you look at labour productivity, you see really quite incredible jump in terms of productivity, in terms of where Indonesia was during the period and at the end of the period. And you also see these very dramatic increases in manufacturing exports over the period that you can see compared to Thailand and Malaysia. Then if we think of a second wave of structural transformation and what it means for inclusive growth, thinking more again that link with inequality. I think the mid-80s to the 1990s were very much a sort of that period whereby there was a dramatic change in the global context due to the Plaza Accord, the change in the exchange rate between the dollar and the yen made Indonesia and a number of other countries suddenly very, very competitive. Also, interest rate differentials drove capital inflows. There's what might be called a kind of two-tier developmentalism, whereby there was more private sector activity, international investments, but the kind of very careful strategic management of that international capital and the continuing support for domestic capital. And the social basis really shifted, I think, towards a sort of rapid employment growth and jobs. And obviously, every job in employment provides further jobs around it. And then again, we see this sort of the emphasis on managing the divergences that structural transformation might throw up in terms of urban and rural policy, thinking about rural development, particularly around food availability, food prices, and food market management. The continued expansion of primary education, managing the skilled and unskilled labour divergence, and also the employment growth that form the social basis. So if we look at some of the data around that period, we see, again, a sort of continuing impressive rise in value added in Indonesia and some increase in employment. We also see a kind of stagnation of the shares for services, while agriculture continues to fall. We see very dramatic rises again in manufacturing productivity, but we also see rises in service productivity as well. And then finally, we have equally incredible jumps in manufacturing exports, but also as the data becomes available, we can say something about the high-tech export content of those manufacturing exports as well. And then bringing us up to date in terms of the most recent period, of course, the Asian crisis and the financial crisis of the late 1990s was very much a point in history for the region, for the world, in fact. And then I think really we come into this era where China woke up. China was growing very rapidly during the 1990s, and then China's entry to the WTO suddenly made China one of the most attractive parts in the world for manufacturing, and one of the most attractive parts of the world in terms of global value chain participation. What we seem to have in many countries, not only Indonesia, is some kind of revivalist developmentalism. If you look at the kind of sort of the kind of policies that have been put in place, there's a substantial number of policies that in some ways look quite protectionist, and so that in other ways I guess there's some attempt to sort of strategically manage Indonesia's place in manufacturing and other sectors. I think the thing that's not so clear after the Asian financial crisis is the social basis to structural transformation. I suppose one could say the social basis is democracy, and the expansion of democracy provides some kind of, well, actually Moglu and others talk about democracy as a kind of a promise of future redistribution or a promise of future prosperity. Democracy has all sorts of forms. Some of them, as we see in different parts of the world, play out in progressive ways, some in less progressive ways. I think Indonesia obviously has a vibrant democracy. I'd be curious to hear views on some of these questions. I think also on the inequality side, this is a period which is very much associated with a dramatic rise in inequality in Indonesia. Arif and myself have been looking at various questions about the drivers of that, and most recently discussing job polarization and routine-based technical change, and exploring some of those questions over the period. I mean, clearly, it's a period of the tertiarization of employment in Indonesia as well, and what appears to be a stalling of industrialization in terms of the shares of manufacturing in value-added employment. So that might imply that people are moving from a more equal sector to a less equal sector. Again, that's one of the things that I've been exploring with Arif. So if we look through the period, I mean, we can talk about obviously there was a major commodity boom during the 2000s, which may in part have led to neglect of manufacturing in a number of countries. We see very volatile foreign direct investment and a decline of debt. We've seen a decline in agriculture employment, what appears to be stagnant manufacturing, a rise in service employment, dramatic rises in manufacturing productivity, and growth driven by total factor productivity rather than simply more capital. The export structure also shifts in terms of high-tech manufacturing and shift back to fuel, which perhaps represents the commodity boom as much as anything. So if you look at Indonesia, this data, because it's internationally comparable, only goes up to 2011 or thereabouts, some of it's 2012. Of course, we can talk a bit more about the patterns since 2012. Certainly the value added and employment in manufacturing seems to stagnate from the mid 1990s to around 2011. And we can talk about what's happened since. That's in contrast in some ways to Thailand and Malaysia, perhaps. And what we see is this expansion of the service sector in Indonesia in employment and in value added. That I think is something that's to think through the kind of growth and employment implications of that. We do see very clear rises in manufacturing productivity, so there's good news there, and I think in services too in Indonesia. What we see also is this kind of decline of manufacturing exports and decline or rise and then decline of high-tech exports, and the return to sort of fuel exports has been very important. I mean, I'm sure all of you who are listening to this will be familiar with many of these discussions, particularly since the Asian financial crisis. Some of you who are older will also be familiar with the previous eras as well, of course. And then through all of this, Indonesia is quite, until the Asian financial crisis, Indonesia was really an example of a country that had done a reasonable job of managing income inequality up to the sort of around 2000 perhaps. Although there was a sort of slight up and down over the period from the mid 60s onwards, compared to other countries, it's relatively limited. I think probably that means that when we think about the 2x2 to talk about the Kuznetian tension between growth enhancing structural transformation and inequality, I think there's effectively two periods that you could place in the increasing inequality, weak structural transformation, which would be the sort of 60s to the mid 70s, and that perhaps the period since the 2000s. Whereas the period for much of Indonesia's structural transformation would probably fit into the stable or declining inequality with strong structural transformation, which makes Indonesia, I think, an important case in managing the kind of divergences that structural transformation and rapid structural transformation might throw up during economic development. So I'll make some concluding remarks about how I see some of these questions, going back to the two questions I put on the table at the outset, and then we can stop for questions. So first of all, so we look back and looking forward. First of all, when we think about structural transformation in Indonesia, but also across Southeast Asia, I think there's three factors that were important. There's many others, but these are the factors that stick out to me. The first is the very strong state elite nationalistic pact for economic development that was evident during the first and second wave. a very strong intra-elite cohesion and a social basis through rising living standards, and very much the visibility of the fruits of economic development, physical infrastructure, employment generation, widely available affordable food. These are very clear social basis, I think, the first two waves. And then I think there's a question mark about the third wave. I think throughout the period, you can see a hyperactive activist state with extensive protection for domestic capital, and there's all sorts of examples. We could talk about that in depth, but also the selective management of international capital. Now, of course, things were volatile from time to time. Sometimes you see a set of policies that are more protectionist. Sometimes you see a set of policies that are more liberal. But if you're trying to look over the entire wave, I think certainly compared to what you saw in other countries, I think there was still a very clear role of an activist state in Indonesia. And then finally, I think something we don't really talk about enough is the role of serendipity, the role of luck. I mean, one way of looking at luck is you're also talking about opportunism. So countries have taken advantage of points in history. So I think Southeast Asia was industrializing at a very fortuitous time. Many of those factors I think would be difficult to replicate in other parts of the world. So first of all, you had the Cold War context, which generated an elite cohesion against external and internal forces. The oil boom of the 70s was very important, I think, in funding industrialization. If you look at the countries that have developed a manufacturing base, almost all of them have some kind of oil. It's quite interesting. It makes you wonder if there's a certain amount of oil that is good and a certain amount of oil that is too much. But a certain amount, certainly most of the countries that went through manufacturing processes of any great size have had some oil in the outset. There was very favorable exchange rate movements due to the Plaza Accord. There was a geographical location that Indonesia sits in, like Thailand and Malaysia. There was interest rate differentials in the mid-80s to mid-90s. And perhaps most of all, something that I don't think we can neglect at all is Indonesia and Southeast Asia industrialized to a considerable extent while China was sleeping. I think it's much harder for developing countries today, given the precision and specificity that's needed to participate in global value chains, to do so with substantially competing against China. And then if we look ahead, I think much of what we see in the past around structural transformation, I think it's very difficult to imagine repeating much of that. I mean, in a way, the kind of the role of the state is quite different now. We can talk about different forms of industrial policy. We can talk about the emergence of new developmentalism in terms of the ways countries get around WTO rules to try and build national infrastructure. But we have to talk, I think, a bit about the changing nature of economic development. So economic development no longer means building national industries. It means it's shifted its meaning to inserting into global value chains, which is really quite a much more minimalist definition of structural transformation, a kind of minimalist definition of economic development. Things are harder, I think, now than they were previously. Then I think some of the, as I mentioned, many of the aspects of serendipity, or you could call it opportunism, many of those are historical periods. It's difficult to imagine some of those being repeated, not least where China was in some of those periods. So as we look ahead, Indonesia, like many developing countries, really faces a conundrum, actually potentially a trilemma. And each of these approaches would imply a trade-off between value added and employment. So if you think about the kind of debate around why deindustrialization doesn't matter, it's largely that modern services like finance and law and business services are increasingly tradable. And so what countries need to do is upskill, have a higher proportion of the population who can work in those sectors, and try and move towards tradable services as a way of generating value added and some jobs. I think the issue here is it creates very few jobs for low skills. And so if you think about mass employment generation, it's a much tougher line to go. Of course, an activist state can promote these things. I mean, it may well be that the COVID pandemic is going to lead to an acceleration of tradable services. In the UK, anyone who can do is now working at home. And so actually, even as an economist, there's probably no reason why an Indonesian economist could do my job at King's College, because they could log in. All of my teaching is online. All of my marking is online. My writing is, I guess, any academic will be writing books. Any academic will be writing papers. So I think there's a real thing about there's going to be a kind of revolution in tradable services that Baldwin has foreseen in his book, which I think is very interesting. Richard Baldwin. And I think the fact that so many people work in London are working in finance, legal services, business services, there's no reason that most of those jobs need to stay in London. And it's going to be a difficult social upheaval when that becomes apparent to companies. Essentially, if you think about these things, I mean, Baldwin talks about the third unbundling in terms of arbitrage of international wages. So I think there's a real revolution coming in tradable services, that countries that have very historical links with the UK, I suppose, like India and England, countries where English is spoken very, very quite widespread, maybe not as widespread as we think, but quite substantially, may find themselves in a strong position. And countries that are able to invest in human capital and build up tradable services, financial insurance, telemigrating is how Richard Baldwin calls it. So I think this is going to be this is potentially a very important for value added growth and could be a very important source of economic development. But I'm not sure it's going to create many jobs for low and medium skilled workers, and that's a real challenge for developing countries. Or developing countries could promote lower value added services that generate a lot of jobs. So you could think, I mean, some of the things that really matter to well-being and human development, health, education, catering, hospitality, government services. These are very good things at creating employment. The only thing is they're quite weak at value-added growth, and they tend to be low productivity. They tend to be quite often informal sector work. So this would be good for jobs, but it might not generate much in terms of value added, which begs the question of, how is a country to achieve further economic development? Or there's a third option, and I think this is the option that Indonesia's trying, and I think this is an option that most developing countries are at least thinking about, and that's attempting a reindustrialization through a kind of new developmentalism. So state-owned enterprises or quasi-state-owned enterprises aren't the same as state-owned enterprises from the 1970s. State-owned enterprises now are functioning as marketized or market state-owned enterprises. China is obviously a very interesting example of this in terms of transnational companies. And so you could imagine subsidies and private exporting to enter global value chains and join global value chains. I mean, this is interesting and potentially could create jobs, but it begs the question of whether these kind of gains tend to be captured by a small number of companies, and whether they'll actually create a lot of manufacturing, or whether they create a lot of jobs in the future. So I think there's a real challenge looking ahead, in the sense that structural transformation in the past was easier. It was never easy, but it was easier than it is today. I think sustaining structural transformation in the long run is becoming harder, partly because of global value chains, partly because of technology, and in particular, routine-based technical change implies that there may be fewer jobs in low-skill employment in the future, although the speed of that remains to be seen. And then in the long run, countries are seeking to pursue economic development in an environment which, because of the COVID pandemic, I think the global economy is likely to be fairly stagnant for several years, probably with the exception of China. It seems that by the end of this year, China will be back to its income per capita or GDP per capita that it was prior to the crisis. So I think that there are many challenges ahead, and there always have been, but this seems to be a particularly challenging time because of the pandemic. I'll stop there and we can have questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Andy. That's very excellent overview, and also fine detail about what's happening in the structural transformations of Indonesia in the context of global world. Yeah, actually, I find it's quite interesting to read your slide about how much luck play a role in helping Indonesia and other Southeast Asian country transform its economy. So one of them, there are so many, so many luck. So Asameglu lists luck as one of the 4 deep determinants of growth. And it is interesting to find that the sleeping China is also, right? So in Indonesia, we have father of development, which is given to Suharto, Bapak Pembangunan. So maybe we should give it to Mao Zedong because he lived long enough to give us time. Well, anyway, it's always inspiring presentation from you. So
thank you.
I think we have time now until in 25 minutes or so. If you have any question, I think I will I'm not really experienced on managing Zoom moderating, but this is not many people, so it's okay. We have around 116 participants, and also I have many people around, not only from the students but also from other. Also welcome Ibu Winnie from Bapenas. I think recently Ibu Winnie from Bapenas has been doing work with ADB with Jesus, on reindustrializing Indonesia. Maybe you want to have something to share too. So just raise your hand, and I will. The host will give you a chance to speak directly. I think I encourage you to speak directly to Andy, so you can. So please, if you have any questions. Okay, there is. I saw Kafis. Kafis raised question. You can go ahead.
Oh, okay. Thank you, sir, for this opportunity. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, it's an interesting presentation tonight.
You can introduce yourself first, Kafis.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Yeah, my name is Kevin. I'm from Mr. Arif's classes from Perekonomian Indonesia. So thank you very much for the presentation itself. My question is, I saw from the previous literature with the data that with the exceptions of Jakarta, labor productivity growth in agriculture is indeed the main driver of the structural change during 1995 until 2010. But surplus labor remains a main feeder of the economy. And what many data say that maybe 10 years until 20 years later, Indonesia will get, maybe from right now, Indonesia will get the demographic surplus. So in that case, in maybe the agriculture itself with so many with a high level of labor itself. So how the government or Indonesia government can ensure the labor productivity and the rise of the demographic itself can be absorbed in this high level of in labor intensive industry. So yeah, that's my questions.
Okay, so I think do you get it, Andy? I think it's about the low absorptions of manufacturing from agriculture. Even in the era where you you think it is the best time for
Mm.
structural transformation, yeah, and then how it can be in the future. So maybe you can make a remark about that.
Yeah, I mean, I struck when Arthur Lewis talked about the transfer of labour from the traditional sector to the modern sector, he was always very optimistic that labour would transfer and the surplus labour would maintain wages at a level where profits would be reinvested. There's a Brazilian economist, very famous, called Celso Furtado, who was much less optimistic about this process. So he believed that the process of transferring labour would lead to stagnation because of the kind of technology that developing countries were using tended to be capital intensive. So I think when we think about the movement of labour from agriculture outwards, I guess we have to think about what are the reasons why people would move to urban areas, or what are the reasons why people would leave agriculture in the first place. And I suspect the kind of, if you look at for Indonesia, of course, you have a quite different picture looking at Java compared to look at some of the other islands in terms of these kind of questions. And some of the other islands are much more resource based. So I think if you're thinking about the transfer of labour on Java, then there may be ways of incentivizing people's movements. I know, although people don't really talk about these things so much, you could think about active labour market policies where governments can provide subsidies and funds for people to transfer to urban areas. I suppose when you think about it, these kind of transfer of labour also bears a sort of, depends on the people or the village's network and how that fits, say, with people that the family or the village know in an urban centre or a manufacturing base. So I think you can think about a set of policies that would facilitate the movement. Obviously, someone has to pay for that, and also at the other end, what you're trying to avoid is a sort of unplanned urbanization with even greater pressure on urban areas. So I think there's a bunch of challenges, but I could imagine you could think of a cash transfer type program that might incentivize labour movement if that's what you are aiming to do. I think it's kind of hard if you can't guarantee the jobs at the other side, though. That's the challenge. I think in a global value chain world, there can be jobs this year and then people can switch suppliers to another country. So it would really entail the government taking a much stronger role on employment and state-owned enterprises seeking to access entry points in value chains. But you could think about a set of incentive. I mean, cash transfers are used to reduce poverty, but also in some countries, conditions are placed so that children go to school and girls go to school and health posts are visited and vaccinations are linked to the cash transfer program. I guess you could think of a cash transfer program that helps people migrate certainly from very poor areas. I mean, Indonesia, of course, has had these kind of migratory programs on a very substantial basis for many years. So I think there are ways that it's possible, thinking at the kind of micro level of what would help someone, and things like cash transfers, even small amounts of cash transfers, might provide some kind of incentive scheme. But the problem is it possible to guarantee there's a job at the other end? Thank you. Your microphone's not on, Arif.
Sorry. Sorry, I have another question here from Pak Roni. Pak Roni Natawijaya is Penjajaran University Agriculture Economist. I may offer Pak Roni to speak yourself to directly, unless you have some trouble in the microphone. I can read the question. Pak Roni, can you speak can you speak?
Yeah, I think so.
Please, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Andy.
Hiya.
Okay. Yes, I'm agriculture economist. So I'm part of the group of agriculture economists who believe that structural transformation from agriculture to an industrial only can happen smoothly when agriculture already has transformation from traditional to modern sector. And again, talking about luck, luckily in Indonesia that happened in your period of 1990s to the present. Started with the foreign direct investment for retail sector, like Carrefour, Walmart, and other supermarket, hypermarket entering Indonesia. They really create a segmentation in terms of the food chain from fully traditional to partly traditional still, but partly moving to modern sector, which is a lot of agriculture economists also excited from perspective of global value chain, where the local production can go into international market going through within the agribusiness rather than export import. My point is actually, can you see in terms of the contribution of agriculture transformation from traditional to modernized in terms of structural transformation? Did you see something different or something new produced in the process, or nothing? Because the expectation from development economists in Indonesia is Indonesia can develop a transition from traditional agriculture to industrial agriculture, which is more processing and so forth and so forth. But since that doesn't work, so my hypothesis is this route going into the value-added process within the agriculture sector can transform faster from traditional sector of Indonesia to modern agriculture. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's a really interesting point. I think you're right that any country needs to move from a traditional agriculture where people are living at subsistence levels to some kind of modern agriculture with capital and technology. I think, modern agriculture is quite often grouped together with tradable services as a potential area where developing countries could develop potential exports and have structural transformation. I think the challenge is it's about trying to identify the higher value-added markets with so many other countries to compete against. So if you're thinking about food exports, then it's not just about the scale of production. It's also about the kind of the international standards and the kind of producing for probably international supermarkets that you mentioned in retailing. And it also begs the question, well, all the people that were working in subsistence agriculture, albeit at very low income, are they to move to if there's few manufacturing jobs, where should they go? Should they go to service sector. I mean, you could think of the second option of a promotion of non-tradable services, which is essentially about services that the domestic population is likely to demand. So I think I certainly agree with you in terms of the need to modernize agriculture away from subsistence to a modern agriculture. And I can see the benefits potentially in terms of exports. I think the bigger question is the sort of employment displacement and ensuring that there are the service sector jobs created at reasonable income levels that people can move to. So perhaps the constraint is really not necessarily the technology, although of course access to that technology is almost certainly through through international companies, unless Indonesia has developed it itself, which is why universities are so important, I think, in all countries. I think there's the issue of where should the people who were working in subsistence agriculture move to? Where are the employment opportunities for them? And it might be completely different on Java compared to the other islands as well, depending on the options are rather more limited. But I think it's a very important area. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a quick question. Maybe there is quick answer to there is one question from Aminuddin here from YouTube. What do you think Korea can be replicated for Indonesia?
No. So I don't know a lot about Korea. My understanding about Korea is Korea benefited from absolutely enormous aid flows from the US, had it very, very preferential trade access to US markets, had the ongoing support of and the disposable incomes of US military personnel living in Korea. And in fact, had a land reform program that created the capitalist class, the middle classes in Korea. So if Indonesia was going to follow that kind of model, I suppose the first step would be the kind of land reform that happened in Korea would need to be put in place, which you can imagine trying to put in place land reform in a country as large as Indonesia would be really, I mean, I know there's been various attempts, particularly at property rights, but a land reform program, then you'd have to persuade President Trump to give lots of aid, which is never going to be easy, although maybe things will change in November, we'll see. And then you'd have to persuade Trump or the next president of the US to give very preferential access to US markets.
Right, okay.
So South Korea is an example of having everything you could ever want, and it can be a success.
Okay.
So if you have all the conditions, you have initial resources, you have land reform, you have preferential export markets, you avoid tariffs, you industrialize while China is very much sleeping. South Korea had it all. And I mean, South Korea is an example of a very successful country going from very poor to where it is now, which is a very, very reasonable place. Replicating it, I'm afraid, I think is really part of history, the factors that made it.
Okay, in the interest of time, I think I will just let two last questions, okay? Because
thank you.
And then there are two that I would like to give question for. It's a bit trade-off here because there's no woman, so for gender balance, I have to let Winnie to question. Actually, Acho raised question first, and then Acho, but Acho was very far away. He's in Canberra, but in the interest of gender balance, I will let Winnie first too. But I will do it at the same time. So Winnie ask question, and then Acho, and then Andy, you can answer at the same time, yeah? Okay. So Please, Ibu Winnie, you can speak.
Thank you, Pak Arif, and sorry, Pak Acho, that I get the opportunity first. Pak Andi, thank you for the interesting presentation. My question is that first, when we are doing the economic transformation, the challenge that we are facing actually how to select the priority sectors for Indonesia cases. How Indonesia should start first? From where Indonesia should start first for doing the economic transformation? My second question is that economic transformation actually sometimes provide the government to have multiple objectives. At the same time, we are going to pursue a high value added sectors to promote economic growth. But at the same time, we also like to create high employment, and also we would like to have inclusiveness from our economic transformation. How to balance this objective? Thank you.
Okay, Acho, please.
Thank you so much, Arif. Good to see you again, Andy.
Good to see you.
It's really interesting, your trilemma concept, and my question is about the trade-off between value added and employment. I think this trade-off can be seen because we are looking at the concept of value added per unit, and that is also what the policymakers usually talk about when they draw policy like downstreaming, for example, which is very popular in Indonesia because the value added in that concept is value added per unit. But I don't think I'm not sure if we really want to focus on the trade-off between value added per unit and employment, because what really matters is the total value added, and that total value added actually is total value added per unit multiplied by employment, right? And then you don't have, seemingly there is no trade-off because we ended up with the high total value added, and this is actually what the Chinese did with the iPhone, for example, right? The value added per unit of iPhone is less than 5%. Domestic Chinese value added for that, but they multiply by thousands, if not millions, of workers in China, and they have huge total value added. So also this is related with your notion about value chain, because in this era of globalized value chain, I think what really matters is total value added, because value added can come from everywhere, right? So we're not supposed to be really obsessed with the per unit value added. Thank you.
Okay, Andy, this is your last remark too.
Thank you. Those are really interesting questions. Thank you. Very interesting questions. So first of all, on priorities and which sector, I think that I guess the first thing is to choose the strategy. And so I'm not sure whether my trilemma and whether those are the choices to choose from. But I think the government, under whatever logic or whatever reason, any government would choose the overall strategy. So if the overall strategy was tradable services, then the government would spend as much as it could on the human capital formation necessary to compete in those tradable service markets. And if the priority was reindustrialization, then that would imply a quite different way of thinking about state-owned enterprises in global value chains. And that's, of course, or quasi state-owned enterprises. To some extent, that the Chinese have done some of these things. And so I think you're right. The kind of multiple objectives is a real problem. Trying to balance inclusive or a kind of economic development that doesn't lead to dramatically rising inequalities is an ongoing challenge. I mean, I think historically Indonesia has done so well because it's supported the rural areas in terms of agriculture, so the rural development, rural infrastructure. So in a way, I think the way to do structural transformation that's inclusive is to think about who gets left behind and try and focus on the regions or the groups left behind. And actually, Indonesia has done a pretty good job of that historically. Of course, over the last 10, 15 years, things have been different in terms of inequalities, the rising inequality. But trying to think about who's not benefiting from the current pattern of growth is probably the key thing to think about. I mean, Arthur Lewis always said that development is usually inegalitarian, and it's for governments to intervene and do something about it. The market is the free market is brilliant at creating wealth, but it's not very good at sharing it around. And so governments have a very crucial role in managing that process so that more and more people benefit than would otherwise. And then the point about defining value added in employment, yeah, I think that's a really nice way to think about it. I'd like to take that and have a real sort of think about that some more, because I really like it. I think that too often there's this kind of, we think of value added per unit or value added over employment, but why not think about value added times employment? And I think that'd be really nice way to go. So I really like that idea. And thank you for giving me something to think about. It's always welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andy, Aco, Winnie. Well, I don't think I can thank Andy enough for having here. I'm sure it's always best to come here because you never miss actually coming to Indonesia or Bandung every year before the COVID. Yeah. Then I also come to London once a while, but because of this, I don't have token for you from Unpad. I'm sure when we met the first time later, I will give it to you.
Yeah, I need a new batik as well.
Yeah. You need a new batik, so we make sure of it
every visit.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Andy, again. Yeah,
thank you very much
for the lecture, and then thanks everyone. Yeah, for attending this lecture to enrich discussion and things, and also give lessons for students who are also attending, also for audience in YouTube. Thank you also for monitoring and then for asking questions. So thank you so much and have a safe, take care, be careful, and then Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih.
Yeah. Thank you, Arif. Thank you, Andy.
Thanks, Andy.
Terima kasih, Bu Winnie.
Terima kasih, Andy. Thank you, Prof. Arif. Ya, Aco, sampai ketemu lagi, Pak.
Ibu.
Thank you.
Ya, thank you.
Makasih ya, Bu.
Salam, Mbak Titi.
Aco, udah datang. Salam. Bye. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you.